afternoon, or morning, depending on where you are. This is our Opsview Essentials class. So this is customarily a 3-hour class, but we've taken the essential topics and condensed them down a little bit. Please do, as Helen said, ask any questions using the WebEx chat facility, and we'll have a few minutes at the end to go over everything. So hopefully by the end of this 40-50 minutes, you'll be familiar with the basic concepts of Opsview, so setting up your base services and hosts, so checking things of interest and organizing your system. And then some of the more useful features of Opsview, so host groups, host templates, and we'll delve into hashtags and dashboards, time allowing. Firstly, I'm going to just cover a little bit about the user interface, so you can comfortably navigate your way around the Opsview system. And to do that, I'll use a few slides, and then we'll delve into our training environment. So we've got a training environment here that we can play with. This is running the most recent version of Opsview. So if you are familiar with existing or lower versions of Opsview, some of this will look very familiar, but some of it will look a little bit more up to date. So we've got our menu along the top, so monitoring allows us to view all of the current systems and service checks within Opsview. Configuration is our entry point into making all of the changes. So here we can see I can change the hosts, the service checks, and then some of the more advanced features that we'll get into. The first thing you see when you log in is customarily this navigator, what we call the navigator. So here we have all of our host groups on the left. So host groups are just a way of dividing our systems, our hosts, into logical groups. So I've organized mine by function. Some people organize it by geographical location, or indeed by customer, or by maybe operating system. But I've gone and divided up. So I've got my databases here, some web servers down here, storage kit here, some networking kit in here. Monitoring servers is a host group that includes all my Opsview infrastructure. So I've got my collector and my overall training system. So this is my main master server here. In the middle, we've got our host status. So as we can see, thankfully, all my hosts are currently up and running. And then we've got service check status here on the right. We've got a nice mixture of green for OK. We've got some criticals going on, an orange warning or two, and then these grey unknowns. Again, that's something I'll get into as we go through the content. Some common interface elements that you'll see and you'll get used to. Shouldn't need to spend too much time on these. We've got delete, copy, and refresh. But this one and this one are very useful options. So we've got the option to dig into our context menu. So just this is where a lot of your configuration will happen. And this we often see this option to either set a service check status or to modify a dashboard or something. So these two worth keeping an eye out for, because that's where a lot of our configuration is going to take place. So for example, I've got the option to edit the configuration for this host, or if I dig into a service check, I can modify the configuration for the service check, and it's all done through that little configuration menu, what we call the hamburger menu or a context menu. So worth keeping an eye out for. And like I said, the first thing you'll see is this page. We organize our systems logically into hosts and host groups, and then we've got our statuses on the right. Anytime I want to see information about a system within my environment, so maybe I want to see what these two criticals are here for this MySQL server. I just click the two criticals, and then our system shows what's throwing a warning. If I want to see everything for a particular system, I click once, and then I get all of the greens, the OKs, and as well as the two criticals that I was previously interested in. So when we are navigating our system, you can use these little checkboxes to keep an eye on your infrastructure. If you are familiar with Opsview 5 or previous versions, like I say, these menus and this system layout will be somewhat familiar to you. What is new is our configuration menus. So This will allow me to view all the current information within Opsview, like I say, and this is where I would begin modifying my system configuration. So if I wanted to add a host, I would go to configuration and I would add a host. If I wanted to add a service check, I would go to configuration and service checks. But we really should explain what a service check and a host is. So a service, a host, and a plugin are fundamental to Opsview. A service is something that I am interested in, so something I want to check. So how busy is my CPU? How's various metrics up in EC2 looking? We cover Azure and GCP, of course, as well. How full is a disk? How much traffic is my switch transporting? Basically anything around our environment that we might be interested in will be a service check. And these service checks we can turn into performance graphs. So we see here we've got some Azure checks here. All of our service checks are organized into service groups, and then they're assigned to a specific host. And I can then view those metrics, both their current status right now and their historical status. So if I am curious about MySQL connections, for example, or any DB connection, I've got that historical data to go and interrogate and investigate at my leisure, so I can see that this has been relatively stable since the weekend. We can export this, we can download it as a graph, as an image, or indeed as we can grab the raw data, so I can export that as JSON or a CSV, and I can move that to one of my dashboards. That's something we'll get to later on as well. If we take this information and we can turn it into one of our dashboards really easily. But the data that our service checks pull in gets turned into graph data, gets turned into historical performance data. All of that interesting service check info, so I'll nip back to this MySQL check again, all of the interesting information we have here, so for MySQL connections, for example, that's all stored. So we've got there a list of historical events, so that's all stored long term. We've also got the current information, and we can see a few other useful things. We can see the host name against which it's running. We can see when it was last updated, when the last status change was, and we can see when we're next expecting this service check to run. And this is going to be different for every single host in our system. So I've got 5 MySQL servers, and they're all running very similar service checks, and that's because we've configured a host template. But for each host, we're going to have service check results. So service check results for MySQL Server 2 is of course going to be slightly different, and they're going to have slightly different performance data, slightly different next scheduled check times. That's all going to be host specific, and that's because our hosts act as containers for services. Doesn't necessarily have to be a physical host, though often it's going to be something like a VM or a cloud system or some kind of spinning hardware somewhere. It doesn't necessarily have to be. It can be a URL or a database endpoint or a SAN or anything really that's addressable. So anything that you can address with an IP address or a domain name can be a host. And we regularly check these hosts to see if they're online. There's a few ways we can do that, but often it's ping, or we'll see if we can make a telnet connection to a system. And all we'll do there is check to see if that host is up. So this is where this data comes from here. So our host status in the middle, is our host up or down? Is it on or off? It's kind of yes, no binary check. It's useful, but all of the graphable information, all of the really interesting stuff that Opsview will do will come from a service check. Our hosts without service checks aren't particularly useful. So if you want to get anything like the best out of Opsview, you need to make use of service checks. And service checks really are just a way of telling Opsview which plugin to run and against which host and how often. So it's our plugins that do the heavy lifting. Our plugins contain the logic to understand whether that service is running, and then pull in that useful performance data, that useful graph data, historical data. And we can change their logic based on the arguments passed to them. So a single plugin can power more than one service check. So if we go back to our MySQL checks here, we'll see we've got quite a few MySQL metrics being pulled in. And these are all powered by, well, most of them are powered by the same Check MySQL Performance plugin. So we've got one plugin that's powering around 35 service checks here, and that's all done using a slightly different set of metrics, slightly different set of arguments that we feed that plugin and ask that plugin to run. So when this menu populates, I will come on. So if we scroll down a little bit and look for MySQL, we can see that it's the same plugin. So the plugin here is Check MySQL Performance, and then we're just using slightly different arguments passed to that plugin to get different information to run a different service check. A service check just comprises of our base arguments. So we have a check period, a check interval. We tell Opsview which plugin to run. So from this list here, these are all default. They will come with Opsview. They will come bundled with, and you can very easily add your own or create your own. But we just tell it which plugin to run and then feed it a set of arguments. So -h is the host address, so it'll almost always have a host address. And then depending on the plugin, you'll maybe have credentials and certain settings. This is very similar for something like an AWS plugin. So if we're interested in AWS settings, AWS metrics, our Check AWS set of plugins will be very useful. So this is all done using the same Check Amazon plugin, and all we do is we feed it slightly different arguments and slightly different credentials. So again, one plugin, many different service checks here. So I think there's like 100 odd various AWS checks, but they're all powered by this check_Amazon check. And these plugins can be written in almost any language, so often Bash or Perl, Python, Golang, whatever your programming language of choice is, as long as it runs on your system and does what you want it to do, it will be compatible with Opsview. And Opsview 6 retains full compatibility with many Nagios plugins, most Nagios plugins, as long as they run on recent flavors of Linux. So as long as they run on recent Ubuntu's or recent CentOS/Red Hat systems, they will be compatible with Opsview. So anything that you found maybe at the Nagios Exchange or up on GitHub or that you've written yourself to work with old Nagios systems will almost certainly work with Opsview. And that's because all plugins need to be able to return, all plugins need to be compatible with Opsview is to return a status and an output. And that status is going to be, let's go back to our summary here. So if I go and take a look at MySQL connections again. To be compatible with Opsview, all we need to do is return this status code, so 0, 1, 2, or 3, and then the output, so performance okay, performance warning, critical unknown, etc. And then anything after this little pipe symbol here is going to be graph data. So anything after our last pipe is turned into a graph data, and that's all that our plugin needs to be compatible with Opsview. It just returns status code, output, and performance data. And you can check what that performance data is going to be by checking here. So our performance data returned by the plugin the last time it ran is an average number of connections, and this is what ends up being graphed here. So these are our graphs. You can see as I start using the system the last hour or so, that the number of connections has gone up. The big thing there is that one plugin could be responsible for powering many service checks, and that's because they change their arguments. Your plugins will live on your Opsview master server, what we now call the orchestrator, or your Opsview collector, which is a system designed to simply run the service checks and send the data back to our main system. Or indeed, they can live on target hosts. So say you've got a Windows specific check, like a PowerShell script or a batch file or something like that, that would live on your Windows system, and then you'd run that via an Opsview agent, and that would send back the result to Opsview via an agent on the system itself. You'll be able to recognize service checks because they always begin with check underscore. So you'll recognize these. These are just me listing my directory output. So you've got all the various check MySQLs, check Opsviews, check AWS. Everything begins check underscore, and that's what Opsview looks for when it populates its internal list of plugins and populates that menu when you select the plugin as part of your service check. Host checks also use plugins, but they don't have the same functionality. They don't return performance data, and they don't have the same granularity in settings. They won't be critical, warning, or okay. They'll just be up or down. But we will use that host check to determine whether the system is up, and that's useful for, well, that's imperative for reporting and whether we actually run the remaining service checks. So these host checks are scheduled to run at regular intervals, by default every 5 minutes. And commonly it's going to be something like ping, or we'll try and open a TCP connection to port 22 or 80 or 443. For Windows boxes, you can use MS-RPC as well to connect and see if a system is online. If a system is online, then we will run service checks as you might expect. We'll check everything as soon as the system goes offline, though. So as soon as the system goes down, we will stop running. We'll stop running service checks. So what you'll see is instead of up and OKs here, you'll see a big red down and 6 criticals. So I can simulate that. So if I set host check status as down, instead of the 39 OKs and 2 criticals, we'll see our big red system is down here, and you can see that reflected right the way through the UI, so you know that something is broken. These go into dependency failure. MySQL server 1 is down, so you know why that service check failed, because the actual MySQL server itself is offline. So if something causes that host to become unavailable, all of the service checks immediately go critical, so you know that there's something wrong. When the host is back up, we will start running those service checks again. Let's have a look at some more of this. Service check configuration options. We've got a few things to set here as when we are configuring our service checks. So I'm going to find my MySQL. I could have selected from our service groups. If I go down to database and MySQL, that does the exact same thing. So we've got multiple ways of filtering your existing service checks. You can actually search if you know the exact name of the check you're looking for, or you can filter by host group. We've got a few options. We tell the tell the service check which plugin to use. So again, we're going to use this check MySQL performance plugin. And just to cover, we've got the host address, so that tells Opsview where to point the plugin essentially. So against which system it's going to run. Then we've got some credentials, so -u, -p, and these are stored as variables associated with that specific host. And then we've got the arguments we are running the plugin with. So all our, in essence, what a service check does at its very basic level is just tell Opsview which plugin to run, when, and with which arguments. That's your basic service check config, and that's how you get all of the useful information into Opsview. You configure a service check to run against a host and to pull in useful information, information you are interested in. And once all of that is in, once that's done for a single system, you probably want to look at ways of logically organizing your system and logically organizing all of those service checks, because we saw there, before I started filtering everything, that there was a lot of service checks and a lot of ways of configuring things. So if we look right down the bottom here, we'll see when this updates that there are over 1,000 service checks. So we're displaying the first 250 of 1488 service checks here. So we'll need a way of organizing these. We can either do that by, like I said, service group, or indeed plugin type. So most of our service checks are going to be active plugins. So that the best way to organize your service checks is going to be using service groups. And to see the existing service groups, we're going to go to configuration, and then I've got service groups here at the bottom. I'm just going to open this in a new tab. And our service groups displayed here on the left allow us to logically organize our service checks. So I can organize them by operating system type, by application. If we go slightly further up again, we've got by database, and even by cloud provider. So I've got my cloud AWS checks, my cloud Azure checks, all of these are logically organized into what we call service groups. And we do the exact same thing with our hosts. So these hosts you see here on the left, they're logically organized into host groups, and that's just a way of laying out our system in a logical, coherent manner. So I've got my various websites, my web servers, all logically organized into different groups. For host groups and service groups, it's good to remember that every host belongs in its own host group, and every service check into one service group. You can't have the same host dotted about in different in different host groups. It's a one-to-one type of relationship. But you can, of course, nest them to help logically organizing things. So you could have maybe an overall cloud host group, and then organize things based on provider, or based on region, or based on function, or based on customer. So it's very, very configurable. There's lots you can do to make sure your system is laid out logically. So there's quite a lot in there, and I went through it pretty quickly, but let's have a quick recap. The host is a container for our services. So a host groups our service checks together, and a service check is something that we are interested in. Plugins do all the heavy lifting, they do all the hard work, and they are the scripts or EXEs that do the actual monitoring. Conceptually, they sit in the middle between the monitoring server and the host being monitored. So it's the plugin that will go and ask the host you're interested in its state. We organize everything into groups, and everything uses plugins. I think we're going to go create a host group and create a new host. Let's go to configuration, and then I'm going to go to host groups. And then in our sandbox, I'm going to add a child host group. call this July 2020. And then I'm going to go and very quickly add a new host. There are a few options when we add a new host, but I'm going to add one from scratch. So I'm just going to add new. I could clone an existing one, or I could import using the API or from a CSV or something like that. We've got a few options. But I'm just going to add a very basic host using the add new button. Just going to call this test host July 2020. And we're going to use the local address so I can actually run a service check. I'm going to add it to the new host group I just created, so July 2020. And I'm going to give it a host template. So see, I've got a host template that I created in June. I'm just going to move that over. So that means that this system, this host that I've just added, is going to immediately start running the service checks that are already in this host template. So if I want to check this host template to find out what service checks it includes, I can see that we've just got some base Unix type checks, so CPU, disk, load average, memory, and swap. So five base, and a service check, a manual service check that I created myself. So what this means is the system I added and the host group I added are going to immediately start running the service checks that are part of that host template. And for that to take effect, I have to apply changes, or for those of us who've used Opsview 5, you might be familiar with the concept of a reload. So until this reload process has taken effect, or this apply changes has taken effect, this new host and this new host group won't have any, won't actually be active in Opsview. So I won't actually be running any service checks. I won't be doing anything with them. And it's really good to double check everything you do before you click a reload, because sometimes it can take a little bit of time. And if you make a typo, so for those observant, for those of us observant in the course, you can see that maybe I've made a typo here. So I need to go and edit this, and to make that active, I need to run another apply change. To correct my previous typo. So anything where you are modifying the configuration of existing or adding to new host or service checks, we need to click this apply changes button and wait for that process to take place, because it's committing things into the configuration database. You can see the changes pending. So if I've made more than one change, you'd see a big list of changes here. We can also go to the audit log. I've just opened it up in a new tab. We can go to the audit log and see the pending changes and the applied changes. So you can see recent changes here using our audit log. So we can see that I added a new host, and you can see this time I just changed the host address. If there are pending changes, you'll always see here that there's a little yellow button, a little yellow icon next to it or on top of it, and you can find out what needs to be applied by clicking apply changes. Then you'll have a number here that indicates how many changes how many pending changes we need to commit. So if you are wondering why you've made a change and it hasn't taken effect, it's usually because you need to apply those changes and confirm them. So we've got a new host group, brand new host, and it's running some service checks, and we see we've got 4 OKs, one red, so we've got time difference. There are a couple of interesting things we see here. We've got this state type and this 1 of 3 and 2 of 3. So what's happening here is we are rechecking to make sure this check has actually failed. So this is our check attempts, our retry interval, and our max check attempts, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But it's good to see this live. So in a moment, that will have gone to check 3 of 3, and then this will be considered an actual failure. We do have a few. I have to go just backtrack one moment. We've got a few types of service checks. So we've got 4 different types: active and passive checks, as well as 2 versions of SNMP polling. I'm going to spend most of this session on active checks because they're by far the most common. They're the checks that Opsview initiates and scheduled. So we will ask a host its status, or its, we will query a host and say, hey, how busy is your CPU, or how much traffic is this interface transporting, that kind of thing. And we'll do that regularly, and we'll base that on the check period. So when we're configuring our service check, you've got a check period and a check interval. So that just means that for 24 hours a day, I'm going to check this system's CPU status every 5 minutes. And you can see that here in, let's pick a system. If I pick one of these database systems, you can see we check it every 5 minutes. You can see the check interval. So I check this every 5 minutes, and I've got graph data coming in at 5-minute intervals. So if I zoom in, I can see I've got every time we check is every time we get a little bit of graph data. So by default, we'll check it every 5 minutes unless the service check fails, and then we'll go down to the retry interval, which we saw really briefly there. So if a service check fails, what we'll do is we'll check it again, but we'll not wait the full 5 minutes. We'll only wait 1 minute to recheck it. So this is to make sure that a system is really down, or this is to avoid false positives, to avoid receiving an alert just because of a little CPU blip, or disk I/O blip, or mini network outage, or a switch interface resetting itself, that kind of thing. Something that's not really anything to panic about, or anything that needs to cause an alert. We'll just recheck to make sure it really is down. And this can be configured if you don't want to recheck, as we call it. You can have that at 0, or you can reduce the retry interval much lower, so you can take that down to 30 seconds or 10 seconds. But by default, we'll have this recheck, and that's where we saw the soft and hard state and the check attempt here. So when this was on check 2 of 3, this was just rechecking to make sure this really was down. And now it's got to check 3 of 3. It knows that there is a critical issue, that this time is hugely out of sync, and someone needs to go and check the system clock. And as soon as they do that, this check will go green again. So that number was the check attempt it was on. This number here on the right is the maximum check attempt, and the state type is hard. So hard is what we consider an actual failure, and soft is what we consider and soft is when we're in the middle of that recheck period. And like I say, these can be configured here. So I've got my check interval, my max check attempts, and my retry interval, and they are set on a per service check basis. There are some other options. Sadly, I don't really have time to go into every single one of them today, but they're your basic sanity checking options: max check attempts and retry interval. Once we've reached that max check attempts threshold, the service check's considered failed, and we start sending out alerts and system is and the host is considered actually in a down or failed state. The other statuses should be relatively intuitive. We've got warning, something may be wrong, okay, everything's within whatever threshold you guys set. Critical, something is definitely wrong, something is down, we need to go and sort this time difference out because it's too high, or CPU usage has been at 100% for the last hour, maybe something there's not quite right, or your disk is almost full. That's something critical. You will see in a few places unknown, and this usually happens when we're initially configuring a system or configuring service checks, because an unknown check usually just means that we haven't been able to run the service check for whatever reason. So I haven't been able to run this for a long time apparently. So I've got 3 unknowns, and we don't know if the check is up, down, or not. So we've got an unknown state there. Sometimes you'll see unknown, unable to process previous result, because if it's a check that is based on a rate, you need certain things to compare against. And sometimes it's simply that the arguments being used are incorrect, and the check just isn't able to run. So whenever you see an unknown, it's because the check hasn't yet run and is in need of some kind of remedial action. We haven't been able to test how. We actually haven't been able to determine the status of our service. And you get similarly with our host check. So we've seen both of these already. We've seen our host is up and our host is down. So our database, we had 1 down, that came back online, and it's now gone back to up and is okay again. You can check the historical status of these. I think it was this system I turned off, or was it system 2? Let's investigate, and we can see that we had the system go down. You can see your events list and current status. So it's been up, and it's all is well. It must have been this one. So these are our recent events. So you can see that it's gone down recently, and sometimes there's a little comment to suggest what happened. In this case, someone broke it. Then it came back up, and all of our service checks were rechecked, and everything went green again. Unreachable is a third type of state, where if you've set that parenting relationship on certain systems, then we don't set up or down, we'll set unreachable. And that's, say, this is useful when you've got systems maybe behind a firewall, or reliant on a single piece of kit or a couple of pieces of kit that you know about. And if those pieces of kit go down, instead of flooding Opsview with instead of Opsview flooding you with alerts, we just set those systems to be offline, to be unreachable instead of down. And a good example of that is here. So I've got this child system that's reliant on these 2 parent devices. So that could be NAS Xbox, or indeed a piece of networking equipment. So if I go and set both of these as down, so that's one system down. Things are behaving still normally. Our child system is up. This one is down. If I set the second one down, then you'll very quickly see that child 1 goes to unreachable instead of offline. So we've got 1 unreachable system here, because the 2 devices on which it relies are offline. So we know that there's no point in running a service check here, because these 2 systems are down, and this would generate unnecessary noise. So this just allows us to get to the root of the issue much faster, because I can now concentrate on the two boxes that are actually causing the other problems. So if you know you've got that kind of dependency in your environment, it's a really good idea to set those up when you are adding your hosts, and that will reduce the number of alerts that you get sent out and allow you to really look at the root cause of the issue. And when we are adding hosts, we're going to need to use host templates. Otherwise, we'll be manually adding in individual service checks to every system, which I'm sure you spotted might take a long time, especially if we've got 1,500 to choose from, and we want to add a lot of hosts. So to speed up this process, we've used host templates, and host templates will be layered on, so you can have multiple host templates applied in one go. We can use host templates to override any arguments being passed to a specific system, and we can apply these in a couple of different ways in a couple of different places. Do that at the host template level, or indeed every single individual hosts. And really, all a host template is a collection of service checks and arguments that we can then apply to hosts. And if we need to apply them to more hosts later on, we can very quickly add more hosts. If we need to add service checks to existing host templates, you can very quickly do that too. So the best thing I can do is just to demonstrate this very quickly. So I've got in this sandbox system, we should see that it's running entity host template in June. So if I was to add a service check to this host template, so if I go and then edit this host template, or indeed add another host to it, or add another service check to it, we'll very quickly see that it's going to start running more service checks. So all I'm going to do is clone this system. So I'm just going to right click. We've got the option to clone it. So we've got the same host group, and its 2 has been added to the same host template. So this system will immediately inherit the 5 service checks that are part of this host template. For the eagle-eyed amongst you, you might notice that I'm not running. So there were 5 OS checks in here, and one check that failed because of the time. I'm not running all of the service checks I'd expect. I would expect to see 6, not 5. And that's because the disk check isn't running. So we're not checking disk space on the first system or indeed the second system yet. And that's down to something we've not yet seen called a variable. So at a host level, they have you have the option to add variables to a specific host. So I'm going to add just a disk variable, and what's going to happen here is the service check called disk is going to look for this variable, and we're going to check the space remaining on our /etc partition, our /etc directory, and that was applied at the host level. So it's only going to apply to one system. So my test host 2 is going to check our disk space as well. So many service checks that we've seen today will be looking for specific variables. So you saw the MySQL check and the AWS check were looking for credentials, and they would be stored as variables for a specific host. So each host would have credentials or other parameters that the service check was looking for. And once that's been applied, we should see back on our navigator that I now have in here a couple of systems, and this one is running 6 service checks. When these start running, so it should be any time now, we'll see that I've got one extra check compared to the one we added previously, but everything else is identical because it's the same host and it's running the same set of service checks. Okay, this brings us on to hashtags. So hashtags, properly understanding our hashtags is essential to getting the best out of Opsview, because we can use them to create useful views for use on dashboards. We can use them for access control, and we heavily utilize them in notifications and reporting. So it's just an excellent way of tagging or combining hosts and service checks to group them together so that we can then do something with the information that this hashtag pulls back. So we would hashtag, say, one of our MySQL servers and a couple of the checks which it runs. So maybe the most interesting service checks. So maybe we would want to hashtag connections and say memory usage to see how healthy our DB is. And once it's active on that system, then we get a more useful view. So if I go to our hashtag view, we can see, so monitoring, and then the third one down is hashtags. We've got a number of already existing hashtags here. So I've got one for my web servers, my Apache servers, one for my storage. Everything seems to be fine. But here we see I've got 4 criticals here on these MySQL servers. So to investigate, I just need to click, and this just shows us that on all 5 of these MySQL servers, we've exceeded, or we've got a critical alert. And then we can use this view when it comes to creating a dashboard, or when it comes to sending out notifications, or when it comes to running reports. So just for these 20 odd service checks, we can create a specific view. We can also edit the hashtag. So if I am creating a hashtag from scratch, I would go to configuration and then hashtags. And this shows us how we would build up and start using our hashtags. So I've got my name, it's enabled. I've given it a little description so I can easily find it, identify it. But here is the interesting part. This is where we decide which servers we want to include, and indeed which service checks we want to include. So if I want to include a couple more service checks, or maybe I'm not so interested in max use connections anymore. Maybe I'm more interested in threads connected or threads running. So I can see that there's 20 objects over 5 servers, so 4 per server. And this will change my view. This will change that hashtag that we just saw. This will change what's displayed when we use that. So that would also display what we were notified on. Sorry, that would also change what we were notified on or what we ran reports on. So we can really quickly modify a hashtag, and then this will allow us to view a different set of information. So when our changes have finished being applied, this view will update, and instead of the 5 criticals and the max use connections, we've removed that, so we're not going to see anywhere near as many alerts, as many warnings. So if we had this as a dashboard, for example, which I think is our final topic of the day, if I go to dashboards, we can create a view based on that specific hashtag that we were just looking at. So I've got my hashtag list, or specific cells, so I can create a hashtag view, or create a dashboard view based on these existing tags we created. And here we've got our single view where we've got an issue, and now that everything is okay in our MySQL hashtag, this has gone green again, and we don't see any reds or alerts or anything like that. We can filter this view, or have multiple views, so I can have this, my networking and some of our Opsview hashtags in the same view. And we can have a dashboard up that shows us it's an overview how our important service checks are doing. So I can have this up on a screen somewhere. You can at a glance see how all of our critical checks are doing, and it's so easy to modify these, so easy to create and manage these, that you can add and remove service checks almost at will. So if I want to add that max connections back, I can do that. I just need to add it straight back to that hashtag. So now I've got 25 objects selected, and what we'll see is that hashtag has been updated, and this dashboard view will very quickly be updated. I'll give that a minute to apply. Because there are a few things we should cover. There are a few things we should cover when it comes to dashboard, because dashboards are dashboards are really useful. One of my favorite things about Opsview, so they provide us just a really comprehensive visual summary of everything that Opsview is currently monitoring. Anything you have up in Opsview, everything you have monitored in Opsview, you can usually view within a dashboard. So we can get our overviews, our summaries, network maps, even a list of current system issues, so current service checks that have just been fired off, or current alerts that have been sent out. And we can combine them with really low-level metrics. So we've got these hashtag cells, one of which has actually gone back to red, thankfully. But next to those hashtag cells, we've got performance graphs, and we can, let's see, got our performance graph here, and we can have a high-level overview right next to low-level graph data, and I can go and decide which systems I want as part of my graphs, and I can decide the metric I'm interested in, and have that right next to the high-level view of my system. So dashboards are really easy to configure, really easy to use, and so useful. So we could say an event table next to our hashtag list, so I can see what's recently happened on certain systems, and then maybe next to that I can have a performance graph that shows memory usage or Unix load average on those servers that we were interested in. So maybe I'm interested in running threads, and I've got next to my list and my overall health, I've got low-level performance data, and perhaps I've noticed a spike, and I need to, that's what caused our issue. So you can combine that kind of low-level perf data along with high-level graph data, high-level system overviews and events. And of course, you can share these dashboards with users. So I can share this. Now, if I name it, I can share that with colleagues. I can make that available to everyone, or just certain roles, or indeed share it via email, or copy a link to it, so that I can just email that right out to colleagues, and they can go straight to my useful dashboard. You can also set those dashboards to automatically cycle through. So if you had this on a large screen in an office, and you've picked, you've painstakingly created a number of dashboards. You can have them cycle through up on a large screen, so you can keep an eye out for anything that's gone red, or you can keep an eye out for various graphs. Like I say, one of my favorite things about Opsview, because they're so easy to configure, and you can do so much with them. They are drag and drop, and they are easily shared. Just about out of time, otherwise I spent some more time on dashboards there. Forgive the haste. But yeah, we've got 2 minutes left. How are we doing, Helen? Did we get any questions?
Hey, thanks, Neil, for the stop tour of Essentials. And if anyone wants to take the class, you can register for that if you go to opsview.com, go to professional services, and then you can see Neil's training schedule on there and register for the full session. The full session goes into so much more detail than Neil's had time here. Neil, we have one question. Do the host service checks need an Opsview client installed to gather the health checks from the host?
Well, that's a really good question. So some will. So sometimes you'll have an agent on a system. So say like a Windows system, you could have an agent on that would respond to queries about disk usage and CPU usage. But sometimes that's not necessary. So something with an API endpoint or a database client, you wouldn't necessarily need to have a host agent installed onto it, because we can query that directly. It all depends on what it is you're monitoring. So sometimes yes, but things with an API or a client, no.
Fantastic. Thank you, Neil. Those are all the questions that we've had today, and we are at the top of the hour, so we're out of time. Thank you to everyone for joining today's session. We have recorded this, so we will be following up tomorrow and sending you a link to the recording. Neil is also back again tomorrow for another quick whiz through Opsview administration training. So 4 o'clock tomorrow. You need to register for that to receive the event password as well. So thank you for joining today. Have a good day, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.